And so, the people of Israel are fighting again for their lives in the wilderness. They've been miraculously saved once before from slavery in Egypt, only now to face just a few miles into the desert a new enemy, the Amalekites, who came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. So Moses comes up with a strategy. He says to Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with my hands held high and pray to God." So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron and Hur went to the top of the hill. And as they began to pray, things happened. In fact, as long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning the battle. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites began to win. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and they put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady until sunset. And that way Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. It's interesting to note that when the Israelites faced the Egyptian army at the Red Sea, actually in those situations the Lord actually fought for them. He miraculously created a path of safety and destroyed the Egyptian army. However, here, just a short journey into the wilderness, there's an entirely different set of circumstances. God isn't shielding the Israelites from this fight. They're physically and they're spiritually partnering with God to triumph over this violent aggressor. As I read that passage, there were a number of strands of strategy that came to my mind. You see, there are those who are down in the valley, physically fighting off the enemy. There is Moses, who had removed himself from the physical battle. He's at the top of the hill, fighting the enemy through a spiritual battle using the weapon of prayer. In fact, the Exodus passage actually tells us that in the action of intercession, the battle was controlled and indeed eventually won. But also there was a third strand of action, and of course that was those who were supporting Moses as they physically lifted his hands and raised them in prayer. I guess for many of us, we perhaps feel like we've been observing a war zone from the safety of our homes, as the NHS have been fighting the enemy, which is COVID. The COVID virus has raided homes and taken lives. I guess we cannot praise highly enough the bravery of those who are fighting out in the valley, fighting a very physical battle and putting their own lives at risk. Of course, there are other unseen battles going on and raging around us. Poverty, homelessness, addiction, domestic abuse, all continue often behind closed doors, and ask, how do we ourselves engage in that fight? I'm reminded of the words of the Apostle Paul in Ephesians 6, who says this: "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." And so this morning I want us to consider that for many of us our role is perhaps as the intercessor. That is, people who place ourselves strategically in the gap between God and a hurting world. I read this week a very inspiring account of Julian of Norwich, who was actually a lady, not a man, as I perhaps thought in the first place. Julian was born in Norfolk in the 14th century. The woman that we know as Julian of Norwich actually grew up in quite a bustling centre of commerce and lived quite an unusual life. Unusual that in her pursuit of solitude and prayer, she asked the bishop to enclose her in an anchor hold. That was a small room built into the side of St. Julian's Church. Incredibly, at the age of 30, Julian fell seriously ill and thought she was going to die. But as she lay in her bed, she received a series of visions of Jesus on the cross. That experience so profoundly impacted her that she recorded her encounter in a book called Revelations of the Divine. However, choosing anonymity, she never actually signed her manuscript, yet it's still one of the earliest books ever written in the English language by a female author. But this was the important thing which I gleaned. The thing which inspired me was, as she lived in that small anchor hold, this small room, Julian had just 2 windows. One window that looked out on the sacred, the divine, into the church sanctuary. There she could attend Mass through that window. However, in the other window, as she looked out straight onto her community. There she could offer prayer and offer wisdom to those in need. As I looked at that, I thought, wow, surely this is exactly what our lives need to reflect as we intercede for the battle going on around us. Men and women placed in the gap with a window of life secured in the divine presence and leading of God, yet well placed to observe through the other window of our life the pain and the needs of the world around us. Paul in 1 Timothy 2:1-6 says, I urge you then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercessions and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and for all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Saviour, who wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. For there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Jesus Christ, who gave himself as a ransom for all people. Well, today we declare to the enemy, it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle belongs to the Lord, and he will give all into your hands. Today we thank God for the privilege of being called into ministry, a ministry of intercession. And so I encourage you to go into the world this week knowing that your prayers can indeed change the world.